Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is the remarkable rhinoceros, and it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Lorraine Doyle. Lorraine, thank you so much for being here today. We are really looking forward to this presentation. Let's go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you so much, Sunny. As always, it's a real privilege to be able to give these presentations. And the reason I chose to talk about rhinos is I think we hear a lot about rhinos in terms of the concept of the tremendous pressure they're under from poaching and those kind of things. But I think sometimes what rhinos are and where they've come from as a species kind of gets lost in that hubris. So I will touch on that and some of the conservation initiatives that we work with in order to try and protect them. But I also just want to perhaps give people a little bit more insight into them as a species, as one of, the remaining mega herbivores within the world. So let's see if I can get this to move. Okay. There we go. So I think for anyone who doesn't know me, this is me kind of in my natural habitat, where I'm most at home, somewhere in the bush. This was taken in Botswana in the desert. No rhinos there, but yeah, still the most amazing landscapes. So I just wanted to basically give perhaps a little bit of background, and please don't run away at the sight of a kind of family tree. But I just always think it's very interesting to contextualize what it is that you're talking about. And so just briefly, the two species, obviously, that we're talking about today are the black and the white rhinoceros. And all this shows you just in very, very brief or broad brushstrokes is it's looking back 64 million years to a common ancestor that was shared with things like horses and tapirs, and from which then you had this divergence, which ultimately, from an African perspective, led us to have the black and the white rhinoceros. As you can see from here, there are other rhinoceros mentioned on here. So the ones that have the cross next to them, those are extinct species. And all of the species that you see here, which are still extant, are either critically endangered or endangered to some degree. So, we're talking about a species that has pretty much been around for some 35 million years in some shape or form, and which now we are looking at populations in certain instances of, a couple of maybe 20, 30, 40 individuals. But this just kind of gives you a picture as to their ancestry, really. So this is just another slide that I thought is really quite interesting. And I think for me, what's most interesting about it is certainly from an African perspective. We tend to think that rhinos are an out of Africa, or what we call an Afrotheran animal, but actually they're not. The greatest amount of evidence that we have suggests that they actually came out of Laurasia. So this was when you basically had the split up of Pangaea, which was the mega continent, which gave you Gondwana land in the south and Laurasia in the north. And so here you have a lot of species, if you will, of rhinos that radiated out across Eurasia, and then basically across the land bridge into Africa. And it's within Africa that we basically seem to have speciated into the black and the white rhinoceros. I'll talk a little bit more about the names and the fact that, you know, the black and the white is a complete misnomer. But essentially, this just gives you a very broad brushstroke. So in terms of remaining species alive, you've got the greater one-horned rhinoceros sitting here over kind of India. You've got a Sumatran rhino further to the east, and then you've got the Javan rhinoceros sitting down in you know, the Malaysian islands. So all of the rest of these species have basically been driven to extinction. So just interesting about how they've radiated out over time. And I promise you this is the last map. But again, it's just interesting looking at historical ranges of things. And if you kind of look within Africa, you've got these two sort of pink blobs, one kind of to the north and one further to the south. Those are your white rhinos. But if you look at the range of black rhinos, black rhinoceros had an enormous range. And to think that now we're probably down to, we estimate approximately 5,000 individuals. It is quite sobering to think that they once had this enormous distribution. And then obviously, if you look at kind of the whole of the Eurasian continent, you can see that this was pretty much dominated by rhinos, which are now extinct. And then you have these little purple blobs where you still have some Javan rhinoceros and a very few Sumatrans. But a very, very broadly spread species. I mean, pretty much everywhere except the far north and the far south, and then obviously the band across northern Africa, which is basically sitting in the Sahara Desert. They're definitely, for the most part, are not a desert dwelling species. Apart from, for example, you have some very well desert adapted rhinos sitting in Namibia, but those are fairly unique populations. So the question of black and white or several shades of gray, the name black and white has actually got absolutely nothing to do with their color. They are all shades of gray, depending on the mud they've rolled in. So on one of the safaris I do for NatHab, we go to Madikwe Game Reserve, and there is a lot of Kalahari sand there, which is very red. So you get red rhinos. And then you'll go into places where you have a lot more calcrete, a calcium type substance in the soil, and you'll have very, very white rhinos. So how the names came up, well, these common names, if you like, came to be is kind of a bit of a mystery, if you will. There's talk that the white rhino, it was a mistranslation of the Dutch wijd, which means wide, referring to the wide lip of the white rhino. Others have said it was because the first rhinos that were properly described had been rolling in these white sands. But I've never really come across a very satisfactory explanation about it. And so more appropriately now, we really call them a hook-lipped, which is the black, and a square-lipped for the white. And you can see in this picture quite clearly the differences between them. One, the white being very much a grazer, it's nature's biggest lawnmower, and then weighing almost a ton less, your black rhino, much more agile, has this prehensile hooked lip, and a fairly grumpy attitude for the most part. So most of us who've been working and living and walking in the bush for long periods of time have been put up a tree by a black rhino once in our career. So they are just notoriously, not, I think ill-tempered is the wrong word, but their sight is not great. They live in thick areas, and so the best form of defense is attack. And I think that's probably the bigger part of why they tend to have this kind of more confrontational nature. Just interestingly, so the scientific name of black rhino is Rhinoceros bicornis, and actually it basically says it's two-horned in Greek and in Latin, so it just got the name twice. And then the white rhino is known as Keratotherum simum. So Greek for horn, thorium is for a wild beast, and simum from the Greek, which is from simus, meaning flat-nosed. So very often the origins of scientific names are kind of extremely obscure, but in some species they're actually quite descriptive. So there are subspecies of both black and white rhino. So the black rhino, 3 remaining subspecies. The western black rhino went extinct in about 2011, we believe. And then the southern and the northern white rhino. Again, the northern white rhino went extinct a few years ago. But those are subspecies, and it's quite an interesting discussion in conservation circles today is, are we at the point where subspecies mean less, and we should just be actually worried about, do we have species in areas rather than being concerned about subspecies differences? So this is just a couple of pictures I've taken of rhinos over time. You can see with this little rhino here, they look so prehistoric. Those huge feet, big ears, and this little like flattened face. What's lovely to see about these rhinos here is that they still have their horn, which all rhino horn is compressed hair. It has no bony core to it. It really is the equivalent of your fingernails. So it's nothing more than compressed hair. And as far as we know, the only use that a rhino has for it is potentially a form of defense in the females and for fighting purposes in the males. So it's not, for example, like elephants' tusks. Elephants actually use their ivory for stripping bark, amongst other things. And so tuskless elephants, which do exist, have a much harder time than elephants with tusks. We, as one of the initiatives that we've had to do over time to try and protect rhinos, is we do remove horn. And there have been to date no obvious problems associated with it. We have noticed territories get smaller, the males can't fight as much, but the thing with it is that it's very early days. And, you know, when I talk early days, you know, this is 10, 15 years. We don't know whether there will be things that we will see arising from this 40 years from now. You know, we don't have that knowledge at our fingertips. So you can see here this, a black rhino, clearly got a lot of different attitude. So head held high, that kind of look of like, you want to come and mess with me? I think not. Just out of interest, you'll see on the ears here, these what look like bits cut out of it. These are ear notches. And this is something that most reserves now do to identify their rhinos. So each position of a notch has a number. And so somebody will tell you that this is black rhino 42, identified by the notches in their ears. That's literally why those are there. But again, you can see this they're considered odd-toed ungulates, so 3 toes, as opposed to things like your kudu, impala, any of your antelope, which are all even-toed. So again, this is just for a comparison, to give you an idea of the jizz, the general impression, size, and shape. The orange one in the back being basically your white rhino, and then your smaller, more agile black rhino, quite a lot smaller in the front there. But if you compare it, when you see them from a vehicle, they look big, but they don't look that big. When you're standing on the ground next to a rhino, you realize just how big it is. And this just gives you, you've kind of got a fairly average sized person here, and just comparatively looking at the size of a rhino at shoulder height. So you get a picture of when you're on the ground with them, they're a lot bigger than they seem from a vehicle. So this is just something to show you about tracks of rhinos. And Marataba, which is one of the places we also go to, has got this beautiful sandy substrate, which is wonderful for tracking. So I don't know if this is. So what I just wanted to, I'm just going to go back. What I wanted to show here is the amazing difference between the front and the back foot of an animal. So this is actually the print of, and there's nothing in here for scale, I'm sorry, but the difference between a white rhino, between the front foot and the back foot. So the same applies to elephants, pretty much to most animals that are quadrupeds. They bear so much of the weight of the shoulders and the head on the front that they have much more round feet in the front, because that's where all of the weight is being supported. If you look at the back print, it's a much more rectangular type print. In the case of elephants, it's more oval, and that's simply because it's bearing a lot less weight. Then what's very characteristic here is that W in the back pad, and that is very typical of a white rhino. Black rhinos don't have, they have much smaller feet. Their toes are set higher up. They're set much more higher up. And they don't have this, we call it a coffee bean type shape, where you have this sort of imprint in the middle. So much bigger, and yeah, with these very distinctive characteristics. What's so incredible is that some of the last remaining outstanding trackers will be able to tell you about individual animals from these marks, these ridges in their feet. So that's like our fingerprints. And the old trackers have learned to identify individuals by that. So yeah, I have nowhere near that level of skill. I can probably tell you whether it's adult or juvenile. Even with male and female, it's very difficult in terms of rhino, black and white, but I certainly wouldn't purport to tell more from that. So this is just a close-up of what horn looks like, and as you can see, you can see the fibrousness in it, that it's not smooth like ivory, so there's no dentine in it. So yeah, literally like it's just compressed keratin. So this was just to give you a little bit of an idea from when we're looking at these from a conservation perspective, and when we're looking at aging rhinos. So we actually give them age classes, and you can see basically an A class, less than 3 months, and so on. And then it differs slightly between black and white rhinos. But again, comparing it, the baby to the size of an adult, and you'll see that they progress in more or less the same, but you start to see the enormous difference between them, literally from sort of 3 months to a year, how much bigger your white rhinos get to be than your black rhinos. So that's just a comparison of kind of age classes and how we, if we're talking about them, if I talk to somebody else and I say I'm talking about a D class, they'll know I'm probably talking about an animal that's 2 to 3.5 years old. And then this is just again about horn growth, really more for interest than anything else. So when they're born, they have this really flat little stumpy bit of horn on the front of their face, and then it slowly starts to grow out. So when we dehorn rhinos, we basically have to dehorn them every approximately 2 years, because it grows enough over that period to make it a potential target again. And you'll just see how different the shape of the horn is. So typically in black rhinos, you'll have this much more upright and pointed horn, again, possibly related to where it lives. And I've actually watched them as well. They will take this horn and they'll kind of wrap it around a branch, and then they'll use it as a lever. And because it's kind of much more upright and there's less distance between front and back horn, it seems to work quite well. So white rhinos just generally bigger, and not and kind of not as upright, for want of a better expression. So just quickly looking at differences in their habitat. So this giraffe was very curious to know what this creature was. You can see very much what we would call kind of open woodland savanna, sitting in the grass, very much an open species. So this is typical white rhino territory or habitat. So one of the things that they do is they spend pretty much all of their time with their lip on the ground, and they're grazing. So they are literally nature's lawnmowers. And what's really interesting is that grasses and grazers co-evolved. So by that I mean, if you take where a tree grows longer from, it grows longer from the tip. So from the apex, the apical bud. What grass does is grass actually grows from the base. And for anyone who's ever cut their lawn and cut the lawn too short, they'll know that the lawn doesn't grow back because you've actually removed the growth bud. So by the same token, if you mow your lawn correctly, you stimulate that growth bud and it will regrow. And so rhinos do exactly that. Rhinos basically mow the lawn at the correct height so that essentially the grass is re-stimulated to grow. So it's a very ancient relationship that has been around as long as grazers, these mega herbivores, have been around. This is the typical picture that you will normally get of a black rhino. It's hiding behind a bush somewhere. It's got its head up. It's looking at you. But thick bush, generally hiding away. This is their kind of prime habitat. Every now and then you'll kind of spot them in slightly more open areas. But yeah, they really are an animal of much deeper thickets. Particularly, there's one particular tree species called a tambuati. It's actually quite a toxic tree. The sap in the tree is toxic. But black rhinos love it. They absolutely thrive on it. There's another plant which looks a lot like a cactus, although it isn't. It's called a euphorbia. Also highly toxic. It has this very copious amounts of milky white latex, which are highly toxic. And I've literally seen black rhinos eating this like it's ice cream. You know, they've got this kind of toxic substance like dripping down their mouth, and it apparently does absolutely nothing to them. So yeah, very interesting how they've adapted to being able to consume it with apparently no side effects. So then if we've kind of touched on this, but just looking again at their diet. So white rhinos, yeah, probably amongst the largest pure grazers that have ever lived. So if you think about an animal that weighs close on 2 tons, and all it eats is grass, the nutritive content of grass is at best not that high, and to sustain that kind of body mass is really quite extraordinary. So these animals are consuming vast quantities, maybe as much as 110 pounds of herbaceous matter a day as an adult in order to sustain them. So yeah, they pretty much, not quite as much as elephants, but they spend a huge amount of their time grazing in order to get in enough nutrition. By comparison, black rhinos, you'll find them munching on anything that's woody. People will often tell me, no, they're grazers too, because you'll have a situation like this where they'll be eating some funny little woody shrub that's surrounded by grass, and people think they're eating grass. They're not. You only have to look at their dung to realize that essentially all they eat is woody material. And obviously there's more nutrition in these, especially you'll see eating something that doesn't look overly palatable. It's got a lot of thorns on it. But these plants are very good at fixing nitrogen. And obviously nitrogen is necessary for protein. So this is a very nutritious meal if you're a black rhino. Definitely not if you're human. It's just you're going to get a handful or a mouthful of very unpleasant spikes. So then in terms of social structures, so this was quite an interesting interaction that we watched on a trip last year, actually, between a mum and her calf. So mum is the one facing towards us, and baby, obviously, and then this male who had decided to come in on the picture. So this calf is approximately 2 years old, and maybe a little less. But when calves are approximately 2, it's possible for the females will consider mating again. So they'll come into estrus and they will potentially mate again. And so the bulls will start to hang around at that point. And they will sometimes relentlessly pursue these females. And this female was having absolutely none of it. The only thing she was interested in was protecting her calf and getting her calf away from this rather annoying male. So there was a lot of huffing and puffing. And also this, if you ever hear a rhino, it's this big animal, and yet it has this very bizarre, like, squeal as a communicative squeal, especially between mother and calf. It's the most bizarre sound to hear coming out of such a huge animal. But these kind of interactions generally take place when there's a male and wanting to mate with a female. And white rhinos are relatively social animals. You'll hear people say, no, black rhinos are very non-social, completely solitary. The animals don't read the books. And so very often we will see on the reserve where I'm based, we'll see 3 black rhinos hanging out together. Well, that's not solitary. So again, the social dynamics are fluid. But normally you will find bulls, either a couple of younger bulls hanging out together, mom and calf, and females will often form what we call crashes. So the collective is a crash of rhinos, and they'll form these crashes, and they'll kind of hang out in an area together. But it's very fluid. It's not a set structure. So you might see 4 of them together today, and then tomorrow they'll all have gone their separate ways. So it's not like a pride in terms of lions, or a herd in terms of elephants. You don't have that same kind of strong social structure. This is just coming back again to that little guy who's like, get rid of that nasty male, Mom. Don't like him. Because very often the males can be quite aggressive in this. And if you've got a male with a big horn like that, they can actually, they can obviously do a fair amount of damage if they decide that they want to. In this case, Mom managed to evade the male, and he went off huffing and puffing on his way. Again, this is another time where there's an interaction where you've got a mom and a calf and a male. And this is the most time when you would see kind of a collective of black rhinos. But like I said just now, they don't read the books. And so you will sometimes find alternate groupings. Black rhinoceros are much more territorial than white rhinoceros. So both male and female black rhinos will have some sort of territorial behavior. This is my space. White rhinos, mainly the males, will have their middens, which I'll show you now, and their ways of marking territories. The females, much less so. They're not really, so long as they've got a good home range where there's plenty of food and water, they're quite happy with that. So again, here, this is another interaction between two males. This one who is, you've got he's urinating, which is a sign of territorial marking. You'll often scrape his feet in that, get the scent of both urine and dung on his feet, which he then patrols with. And this much younger bull is heading for the hills. So he's realized that this dominant bull is much bigger than he is, and his best option is to remove himself from the situation as fast as he possibly can, because otherwise this would have ended in a confrontation. You'll see that this animal here is wearing an ankle bracelet, or somebody dubbed it a rhino Apple Watch. I'll explain a little bit more to you just now about what these are. But yeah, this was really to just show you the kind of interaction that you will see between these kinds of animals. So just a little bit more general behavior. This was a couple of young bulls that were hanging out together. Like I said, it's not an uncommon thing when they're this sort of age. They'll go around in groups. And they will also start to now try and hone their skills and their dominance even amongst each other. So this is not for breeding rights. You know, these are not at breeding age. And so essentially they are just sizing each other up. And you'll see this kind of crossing of horns, which is just more of a look what I can do. So this was just another shot. I think there had been a little bit of this. Looks like they might have actually had a little bit of a spar with each other, but nothing major. What's interesting here is you can actually see pretty much the growth plate here. So when we dehorn rhinos, we basically put 4 fingers between where the horn is actually growing from and where we actually remove horn from. And that's to protect the growth plate. So it's literally like the cuticles of your fingernails. That's the equivalent in a rhino. And so you don't want to damage that because otherwise, obviously, it has a blood supply and nerves. The rest of the horn is like cutting your fingernails. But you can see where the growth plate kind of ends here quite nicely. So rhinos spend, if it's a nice warm afternoon or if it's a cold winter's morning and they can find somewhere to just have a little sleep, they'll literally just kind of plonk their head down on the ground and just have a bit of a snooze. They will roll over, especially black rhinos, but white rhinos as well. They'll kind of roll on their side, especially if they're wanting to roll around in mud. But from a sleeping perspective, they'll normally kind of sleep in this almost semi-recumbent position. And you can imagine the weight of their body mass pushing on internal organs if they're not supporting themselves in some way. And so, again, it's another thing that when we work with rhinos, we have to be very careful about how we position them, so that you don't impact their breathing in particular. So just again, interactions with other animals. So this was a very interesting interaction between some fairly young lions who had obviously been left. I think mum was out hunting, and this rhino kind of blundered into the middle of the whole story. And this rhino was kind of not particularly perturbed in the slightest by these young lions. And then he proceeded to chase them around for a bit. And so you can see there was one very, very cautious lion cub, like looking at this big gray thing, very clearly not quite sure what to do about this. And eventually the rhino lost interest and he just kind of bumbled off. But this interaction lasted for quite some time. I mean, probably, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes. And I've seen it a number of times where there's been interactions between young lions and rhinos. So in terms of predators, adult rhinos don't really have many natural predators apart from humans. Baby rhinos can fall prey to lions, to adult lions, when they are very small. But beyond that, most of the time, rhinos are not going to feel particularly threatened by lions, and certainly not by young lions. They're more likely to be curious and to work out how they can push them around. But yeah, it's interestingly, I've never really seen that sort of interaction with wild dog or cheetah even. It just seems to be something that, I mean, perhaps because lions are pride animals, you know, they're kind of together, and there's this curiosity between the two. Yeah, so this was just another kind of picture showing you a front on of a black rhino, very obvious ear notchings. You can see small eyes set quite far forward. So their eyesight, rhino's eyesight, from what we understand, is really not good. Very short-sighted, but an incredible sense of hearing and an incredible sense of smell. And on those two senses alone, smell and hearing, they will pinpoint somebody's location and they will know exactly where they're going, even if whatever it is that they're going to charge at is kind of just a bit of a blur. So then all of these animals that are interacting in their environment have got some kind of impact on that environment. And essentially, they are really important to the functioning of natural ecosystems. So you may have heard that people refer to elephants as being ecosystem engineers. And by that, they really mean that here you have an animal which is so big that its impact in environment actually can change the structure of a habitat. Interestingly, impalas are also ecosystem engineers in a different way, in that they are ecotone specialists. So they kind of live between the more flat, open areas and slightly more woody hills. And they literally shape that landscape. And you can see where there's been impala in the landscape, because you'll have this kind of browse line, because impala both graze and browse, and they literally form these like hedges. So all of these animals have some kind of impact on their environment. So these animals, so rhinos, elephants, buffalo, basically it's called geoforming. And what they're doing is they're transforming the landscape around them over a period of time. So here you probably had this very obvious clay soil, probably had an elephant that came and stuck its foot in when it was really muddy after rain, and it made this big hole. And then what happened is Rhino would have come along and maybe kicked it around a little bit, scuffled a bit, and then elephants would have come back, and you would have had this constant interaction. So what happens over time is these animals then create these mud wallows. And if you're a big rhino and you've got ticks on you, nothing better to do because you can't pick them off, is you go and you roll around in this clay mud. The mud sticks to you, it dries, and as it dries, it obviously contracts. And at the end of the day, you then go and you rub it off, and along with the mud, you also take off the ticks. And so what was quite interesting is there was a study done in 2014 that said that rhinos possibly had a more significant impact on the landscape from a geo perspective, from an Earth type perspective, than elephants. When rhinos wallow, they take a lot of mud with them. They rub it off, and so what happens is you've got all this fertile alluvial soil that's collected in these wallows, and now it's being distributed. So you're taking fertile soil and you're moving it around by virtue of the rhino actually moving it for you. So they have this very significant impact in the landscape. Then this is another thing that you will see very often in game reserves. You'll see these wooden stumps which are smooth and shiny, often with lots of footprints around them. And you'll see rhinos, other animals too, warthogs will do it, elephants. So they'll come and they'll literally rub themselves against these rubs, and that's to get ticks off, and yeah, just basically to have a little bit of a spa. So this again is all part and parcel of their shaping of a landscape. So this is just exactly what you probably think it is. It's a big pile of poo, but it's referred to as a dung midden. And so this is the equivalent of a rhino's Facebook page or Instagram account. So what the particularly males will do is they will go and defecate in the same place along a set route year after year after year. And so they form these enormous middens. And these are really signposts saying, this is the edge of my territory. If you are a male and you come in here, especially if you come and you deposit a dung pile on top of my dung, that is an open challenge. And I will come after you and I will find you. And there will be an interaction between us. If it's a male who just wants to pass through, he's not interested in the dominant males, females, what will often happen is he will leave a calling card to the side of where the main dung pile is, as will females and youngsters. So one is considered a direct challenge. The others are considered, okay, well, I'm offering my deference. I'm not going to interfere with what you've got here. I just need to pass through, or you've got a water source I need. So this is very much a communication network, and many animals use dung for communication purposes. Wildebeest, impala, lots of animals that have some sort of social structure will actually use dung in a way of communicating via scent. You must remember that we as humans have got an appalling sense of smell by comparison. And so these animals have a completely different view of the world to us. And so this scent plays an enormous part in their daily life. So the other thing about dung is you will often see, you'll see, so this is a Swainson's Franklin or spurfowl. You'll see them rooting through the dung. And this is because these animals do not have the greatest digestive tracts. So a lot of what they consume passes out undigested. And so there'll be termites that are in here. You'll have grubs, caterpillars, all sorts of things And these birds will come and scratch around, and very often it's quite rich pickings for them. So sometimes if they're digging around in black rhino dung, you'll see that because they are a tree or a branch eating, there may be fruits, and so you can have undigested seeds. And again, this is, these are rich pickings for birds. So it's kind of a snack shop for them. And then obviously the animals that really are critically important as nature's recyclers. So dung beetles, they're another group of animals that I just find completely extraordinary in terms of their ability to engineer a landscape, remove dung that could cause so many potential problems in terms of disease, and then utilize it in order to lay their eggs. So just completely unrelated really to rhinos, but something that I find really interesting is the ancient Egyptians worshipped scarab beetles, and dung beetles are a form of scarab. And the reason was they believed them to be immortal because they only ever saw adults. And what we know is that in this situation, you've got a male sitting on top of the ball and a female on the side. He will roll her around. She'll hang on to the ball. She won't let go. What will then happen is this ball will be buried and it'll have, in this case, one egg laid in it. So that egg will then hatch into a grub, which will then eat the dung inside the ball and hollow it out. It will then pupate inside the hollowed out dung ball. And this always just strikes me as incredible. If you break open that dung ball midway through pupation, all that you will find in there is white goo. There's nothing. It's formless. And so what happens is this animal, which is coded for as a caterpillar or a grub rather, actually then reassembles itself into an adult beetle. And then the adult beetle will eat its way out and emerge as an adult. So it's not immortal, but it really is quite an extraordinary animal. And so they really are dependent on a lot of our mega herbivores. So you do get ones that specialize in carnivore scat, but a lot of them are dependent on things like elephant and rhino, simply because they produce such copious amounts of dung. So rhinos are tick hosts. Now ticks are, for anyone who lives and walks, particularly in the bush, we do not have a very amicable relationship with ticks because they bite and they're very unpleasant. But obviously, if you're an oxpecker, this is your this is your bread and butter. And so what's interesting is there's actually a species of tick called Dermatocentor rhinoceros, I think it is, something like that. But it's actually restricted to rhinos and to rhinos distribution. So whilst I doubt anyone would mourn the passing or the extinction of a tick, it's one of those things that if we were to lose rhinos as a species, there are other species we would probably not even know about that we would lose at the same time. So there's a lot of these co-relationships that happen that, very often we're not aware of. And so this is just, again, these short grass lawns. What's really important about these is they keep this grass very short. And certain birds, longclaws, larks, pipits, they are grassland species and they require short grass areas in order to survive. So white rhinos create these lawns. And also when we have fires, which are also part of savanna ecosystems, if you've got very short lawn like this, slow moving animals like tortoises, in particular, can actually find refuge because there's no fuel load in these short grass areas. And so these animals can actually be protected there while a fire goes through. So again, sorry, another example of how these animals actually manipulate the landscape. So just the last few slides, just a little bit about their conservation status. So this is based on the IUCN, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And as you will see, the black rhino is considered critically endangered, one away from extinct in the wild, possibly 5,000 individuals left across the globe. White rhinos, I actually think they've probably moved in the last few years from near threatened to vulnerable. Not sure, but possibly between 40 and 50,000 individuals left across the world. Or across Africa, rather, sorry. And so you can see that both species are, have been significantly impacted by two things. One, poaching, which, everyone is aware of, but the other is habitat loss, especially for black rhinos. Black rhinos need dense, thick areas, low concentrations of rhinos. They don't do well if there's, too many rhinos in a small area because they're strictly territorial or strongly territorial. And so they face the double challenge of poaching and habitat loss. And so, this is just a concept, if you will, of the challenges that many of these species are facing. So this, I spoke to you about that Apple Watch bracelet that Rhino had on. And this is relatively new technology that we are using. So those collars are artificial intelligence enabled. So they actually are programmed and they learn the rhino's behavior. So we have towers, and when the rhino goes past a known tower, it will ping off the tower. So we know where that animal is. And then we have programs that allow us to look at the movement of these animals. We can see when animals are interacting with each other. So we can get monitoring information from these systems, but they also help from a protection point of view, obviously. So this was something that we did on the reserve I'm based at recently. We started putting these collars on. We are still dehorning our rhinos at the moment. You can see our vet is dehorning there. My hope is that if these bracelets are successful, that maybe we will have enough of a deterrent and fast reaction time that we could perhaps stop dehorning them. But that is definitely not something that is going to happen in the near future. These little boxes here, these are solar. This is a little solar panel. And all the solar panel is there for, it has a battery. Batteries normally have about a 2-year life, at which point you have to dart the animal, remove it, and replace the unit. What has been found with having a small solar panel is it actually trickle charges the battery, and so these batteries are lasting longer. The less we have to dart an animal and interact with it and interfere with it, the happier we are as conservationists. And so this is very exciting new technology. Born in South Africa, this is Dr. Espia Leroux, and it's his brainchild. So yeah, very exciting, interesting, and hopefully something that will help us protect the species. And then just the very last is, I spoke just now to the fact that black rhinos in particular are threatened by loss of habitat. And so this project was initiated by a South African vet, Dr. Jacques Flamont, and it's part of a World Wildlife Fund project called BREP for short. And what it does is a reserve will get what we call a founder population of rhino. So on a reserve, you'll be given X rhino. When those rhino breed, the first rhino born to a female that gets to 5 years of age will then belongs still to the Parks Board, and they can decide in conjunction with BREP where that animal will go to. The second calf born to that female will remain the property of the reserve which raised it. And so this was part of an initiative that we were involved in 2019 on this reserve I'm at. So this is darting one of the black rhinos born on the property that got to 5 years of age, and it was now time to translocate him to a new property. So this animal was darted, and this is the kind of process that goes on when you're darting rhinos. So we put things into their ears to try and minimize the amount of sound that they hear. Remove sight, all of this just assists with reducing stress. The animal is also sedated, and actually the same drugs that give humans retrograde amnesia, so they don't remember what's happened to them, are utilized in any form of animal darting as well. And we believe from things that we've seen that it has the same effect. So the rhino is then basically put into a big container, and then off the rhino goes to its new home. So these rhinos were actually sent up to a park in Malawi, and there were two rhinos that were sent. One of them had a mom who was a very, very grumpy rhino. Well, the reports that we get from him, and we've been sent photographs, all the photographs have been taken from somebody up in a tree looking down at this rhino. So he's taken his mom's temperament and he's gone with it. But they have both now been in Malawi, doing very well in an Africa Parks property up there since 2019. And so this is the idea of trying now to be able to have them in a safe place, raise them to 5 years when they can be fully independent, and then put them into a new property where we can try and expand their range again. And yeah, that is very much a WWF project, which from NatHab's perspective in terms of their partnership, this is kind of seeing what's happening on the ground in terms of WWF projects. And that's all from me. So yeah, if there are any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. We just have a couple minutes, so let's just dive in. A couple folks are aware of a private ranch that was selling rhinos. And apparently in one of the questions, it suggests that they did not actually succeed in selling rhinos. Are you aware of this or know anything more that you can share with us about that situation?
Yeah, I can. So there was a gentleman by the name of John Hume, and he decided that they were going to legalize rhino horn trade, and he was going to get very rich by farming rhinos. And anyway, to cut a long story short, it all didn't go according to plan. And so then he was in a situation of where he had this excess population of white rhinos. As far as I know, they have tried to kind of home those white rhinos. White rhinos are much easier to deal with than black rhinos. But I know it started actually getting quite difficult. I know there was challenges in the courts, and I'm not exactly sure as to how far this whole process has gone. But this only really became evident about maybe 6 months ago. So I am aware of it, and I do know that there's been an attempt to relocate these rhinos ethically. But yeah, unfortunately, wherever there are humans involved and potential money, sometimes the lines get blurred.
I understand.
Yep.
Well, we have time for just one more question. We've all seen many photos of oxpecker birds riding the backs of rhinos. Can you talk a little bit about their relationship?
Yeah, sure. So the oxpeckers generally will say that it's actually a beneficial relationship to the rhino, because obviously the oxpecker takes the ticks, so it's a mutual relationship really. So rhino gets rid of tick, oxpecker gets food. The only time where these things tend to get a little less helpful to the rhino or any animal that has an oxpecker on it is oxpeckers obviously don't eat ticks per se. They eat them because of the blood in them. And so if they find a wound on an animal, oxpeckers will often try and keep a wound open in order to keep a fresh supply of blood, in which time you kind of get a bit of a parasitic relationship. But for the most part, oxpeckers are incredibly useful to any of these animals that have ticks on them. So yeah, we would, for the most part, we would consider it a mutualistic relationship. So I hope that answers the question.
I think so. I'm going to turn it back to you at this point for any closing comments.
Yeah, just to say thank you for listening. And yeah, thank you for, through NatAb and the safaris that we do, we really have an opportunity to help these animals. And these are a flagship species. And I think they enable us to turn the spotlight on some of the other animals out there. So yeah, just thank you.
Well, thank you again for presenting to us. I want to thank those who tuned in this today. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can find this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.